Good morning.
Good morning, Judge Dali.
Good morning.
Okay. I hope that this is better. When we tested it a couple of minutes ago, there was some feedback on my end. So now that that's been resolved, I just wanted to say good morning, everybody. And on behalf of Strat-Based ADR, Democracy Watch, and Transparency International Philippines, I wanted to welcome all of you to our post-SONA virtual town hall discussion entitled Continuing Political Development Towards a Better New Normal, Making Public Institutions Matter. This event is happening with the backdrop of the recent signing of the anti-terrorism law, attacks on media and business groups, as well as the fifth SONA of President Duterte. And we believe, all of these events make this event all the more timely, and we look forward to a very fruitful discussion ahead. To officially open and welcome all of us to today's event, may I please welcome Professor Dean Dumanhit, the president of Strat-Based ADR Institute, for some welcoming remarks. Professor Manhit.
Good morning, Paco. Thank you.
Morning.
And good morning to our speakers, our key resource persons. We appreciate your participation. And also, of course, to our participants who have registered the past few days. We are looking forward to a good discussion, learning from experts, learning from people who value reforms and institutional challenge, and to address institutional challenges in our country. Allow me to share a few slides just to recall why we do these things in Strat-Based ADR Institute. Part of our commitment in Strat-Based, in our different teams, is that we try to track what we call risks in our country. Of course, early on, we saw this Wuhan virus as early as January, when our own health team tracked it. And since then, we have adjusted last June what we call 8 pandemic risks. And key to understanding this pandemic risk is we have asked our team in our business and political intelligence team, Strat-Based Research and Intelligence Group, to track what we call these strategic surprises. But what I'd like to focus on today, and something that I've mentioned in a commentary that I shared with Phil Starr the day after the SONA of the president, is that our number one risk from a governance perspective is what I call COVID-19 corruption, a possible corruption. Because it will affect democracy, it will affect results of the 2022 national election. And I'd like to share some thoughts that I wrote in the Philippine Star last week, where I argue that Philippine society is at this critical moment, confronted by 2 conditions. On one hand, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the penultimate year of the Duterte Presidency. We all know by 4th quarter next year, candidates will be filing, coalitions will be built with the objective of winning in the 2022 national election. But setting this aside, the elections, we continue to deal with this reality, the continuing public health challenges. Corruption that even our own president keeps on harping. And what our greatest fear is, the economic consequences of this pandemic, the inequality. Our president, in his SONA, was able to provide maybe a tinge of hope, the falling optimism of the Filipino people. But we all know that despite his charisma and strong political will, much more could have been said and articulated on how the nation plans to recover and build better. And here we are, waking up with a new instructions from our government, we're back to modified ECQ. I'd like to share this graph. We have tracked this since January, start of this year. We've seen the sudden drop because of the new definition of what is recovering. But still we know that 103,000 total confirmed cases. After the longest lockdown, and receiving from government reports of how much we have spent. Over 374 billion in interventions since the lockdown of March. Loans have been contracted to support the national budget with some of our international development partners. In US dollars, over $5 billion. And when you look at it, how small the amount for actual COVID-19 response. And that is where I believe should be the guide as we discussed. In my commentary, I wrote, the rants expressed by the president at the beginning and end of his SONA, and even I'll add the rant that he did against the health workers early this morning, could have been spent in explaining the meaning of better governance. Questions like how could it mitigate social risk, alleviate inequality, combat corruption, or ensure transparent and accountable spending of all this COVID intervention, or even financing the implementation of the Universal Healthcare Act. Inclusive recovery could indeed be an all-encompassing strategy only if the life of Filipinos in the new or next normal is participatory. In our first virtual roundtable last May, some of our colleagues in the academe spoke of the approach of government, highly securitized approach. Why so? So again, here we are. Maybe we need stronger public institutions, responsive legislation, good governance based on transparency and accountability, and a more responsible citizen. I keep on hearing government speaking of whole of government solutions. Here in Strat-based ADRi Institute, we speak of whole of society and strengthening of political institutions, and the shift to e-governance and continuous political development in building a new and better normal for the country. Again, good morning to all our participants, speakers, resource persons. We hope that this virtual town hall discussion will be the starting point for collaboration towards a democratic society founded on responsive, rule-based governance and an engaged citizenry. Thank you, and good morning again.
Oh, thank you, Professor Manhit, for officially opening our event today. But before I introduce thank you then, sir. Before I introduce our first speaker, I think I should introduce myself, which I forgot to do earlier. My name is Paco Pangalangan. I'm the Executive Director of Strat-based ADRi Institute, and I'll be your host for today. That said, let me now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ronald Mendoza. Dr. Ron Mendoza is currently the Dean of the Ateneo School of Government, and we've invited him today to share some of his ideas similar to those that he's expressed in recent interviews, which have been quite interesting and very enlightening. And we look forward to being enlightened even further by Dean Ron. Dean Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paco, and thank you very much, Dean Do, for the chance to join you today. It's another Monday, and we are welcomed with basically this news that we are back to modified ECQ, and of course, we are very concerned in terms of the direction we are taking. If you will permit me, I will take a step back and focus on the topic which Christina and Paco told me was about institutions and the general backdrop of our democracy today. And I will try to link my remarks to the ongoing COVID-19 health pandemic towards the end. So permit me to excerpt from my foreword in the recently republished volume by Rick Manapat, Some Are Smarter Than Others. This volume narrates how corruption can take place on a grand scale, and Some Are Smarter Than Others ties together the many pieces of evidence, from Malacanang executive orders to crony connections and backdoor deals, to the rise of political and economic fortunes of both would-be industrialists in Manila, as well as political warlords in the provinces. I believe these excerpts are cogent and very relevant to our times today, and I'm very happy to share with this group that the volume is out and is going to be made available to a new generation of readers who are looking to defend institutions and basically advance the reforms that we need to advance as far as our democracy is concerned. So let me begin with the excerpt. Since the Marcos regime was toppled by people power in 1986, the country saw 2 more presidencies implode under corruption charges, only to be pardoned or found innocent years later. It is less surprising than in recent years, the populist appeal of an all-powerful leader who can fix the nation's problems has risen again. We should emphasize here that this is not new, and that Marcos himself promised, quote-unquote, to make the country great again under his rule. In this book, if this book must highlight anything, it is the simple lesson that no leader can fix the nation's problems alone. Power in politics or economics, when concentrated in the hands of an unaccountable few, can only lead to abuse and failure. Only institutions and stronger democratic governance can bring about sustained and inclusive development. Yet building institutions takes time. And in an imperfect and still developing democratic environment, the road to progress is often circuitous. Even more so in a country with lingering poverty and growing inequality, a population that remains susceptible to would-be patrons, promising easy solutions to complex problems. Unsurprising then that the slow and steady democratic project paves the way for its most mortal threats. Opportunistic populists who promise immediate development gains for the masses, yet in doing so take the same shortcuts made by despots, weakening institutions, unhinging social cohesion, and undermining trust and collective action. Sadder still, institutions that took decades to rebuild may take a mere few years to debilitate under authoritarian and populist regimes. Meanwhile, the economic aftermath of the Marcos dictatorship is palpable. After the economy collapsed in 1983, driven in large part by the massive and unsustainable debt that initially drove the economy but later caused it to implode, the country's external debt expressed as a share of GDP peaked at almost 80% under Marcos. Yet today, thanks to judicious borrowing, disciplined repayments, and a faster growing economy, at least prior to COVID-19 that is, it rests at around 24%. In all, it took about 2 decades for the Philippine economy to recover. The real GDP per capita in 1983, expressed in 2005 US dollars, was recovered only in 2003. Put simply, the Philippines in 2003 merely recovered the economic wealth status in 1983. Still, we have managed to accomplish important institutional and economic development gains since the fall of the dictator. The very things that signal the Philippine economy's competitiveness today, an independent central bank, an effective fiscal and treasury management system, strong checks and balances built into public procurement and public-private partnership tenders, increased competition introduced to once monopolized economic sectors, stronger oversight over government-owned and controlled corporations, among many others, are the very things that differentiate the Philippine economy today from the Marcos-era economy. These are some of the reasons why investors are willing to take a look at the Philippines again, the very institutional strengths that earned the country the sovereign credit upgrades in recent years. True, we still have a long way to go to build a more robust and inclusive democracy and economy. But we must protect against the opportunists and historical revisionists who would have us return to the authoritarian years by peddling a false nostalgia for today's generation. Let me begin to conclude by noting that many of these important gains, for instance, our debt sustainability and macroeconomic fundamentals, need to be defended as populism has a way of threatening to erode them over time. Upholding the rule of law, covering, for instance, the protection of our sovereignty, human rights, and contracts, may look like separate institutional elements, but they are actually part and parcel of one whole economic and democratic recovery. In our democratic setting, one cannot cherry pick and build only some institutions while watching others weaken. The imbalance will cause the entire institutions building project to collapse. Furthermore, some of these recovered strengths may weaken because of our inability to manage COVID-19 effectively. At this point, rising cases, rapidly filling hospitals, a return to tighter lockdown, and a slowing economy could push us towards some of the same strategies unsuccessfully deployed during the dictatorship. Debt-financed infrastructure projects implying trickle-down economics and the fire sale of many businesses ripe for takeover and consolidation, all in the name of crisis response. And rather than directly address the health crisis in a timely and decisive manner, some of our leaders burned precious weeks focused on highly divisive issues, the anti-terrorism law and the failure to renew ABS-CBN's franchise. Meanwhile, the backdrop of weakened institutions, weakened competition, and questions on media freedom and the freedoms to express dissent, and a faltering economy are some of the risks we now face too, in addition to COVID-19. To some, bad governance is just as deadly as a health pandemic. It could certainly make a pandemic even deadlier than it already is. And certainly it is a recipe for division and uncertainty during a time when we need social cohesion and trust in public institutions. The reform and advocacy agenda to protect the rule of law and to preserve democratic institutions is quite urgent, and I thank ADRi for gathering us today to raise these issues before it's too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Ron. Thank you for that, po. Next up, I will move quickly now to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Julio Tihanki. Dr. July is a professor of political science and international studies at the De La Salle University, where he has also served as a former dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Yes, Dr. Tihanki, am I right? Sorry, I'm talking to the team now. Am I right that Dr. Tihanki is next up?
Yes, sir.
Yes? Okay. Thank you. I wouldn't want to introduce somebody who wasn't ready. So, Dr. July, the story is yours. Hi, Dr. Tihanki. I think you're on mute.
Good morning.
There we go.
Morning.
Morning. Good morning, po. Go ahead, sir. Hi, Dr. July. No, sir.
Ako na ba?
Yes,
Is it my
po.
turn?
Yes,
Okay,
it is
sorry.
your turn. It's
Okay,
all right.
sorry.
That's all right.
Okay. I'll just
Yeah, these sort of things come with the virtual webinar territory, so we understand.
okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you this morning, and I would like to thank the uh, organizers for inviting me. I would just like to discuss with you, um, of course, a couple of weeks back, President Duterte proudly declared to the entire nation that after a couple of days before, after the House Franchise Committee rejected the renewal of the franchise of ABS-CBN, he proudly proclaimed that he dismantled oligarchy in the Philippines without declaring martial law. Of course, since he ascended into power, this was just the latest of his actions that were directed towards the so-called oligarchs of the country. And up until this point, he was indeed successful in threatening, the so-called powerful oligarchs in the country. And we have to understand that this is part of the president's populist narrative. And he is, in a way, in the same genus, in the same category as his populist cousins all over the world, which have emerged in recent years. No? And the core of the narrative of any populist is to depict society as it divided between the so-called pure people versus the corrupt elites. No? And excuse me. So that has always been his narrative. And in order for him to sustain his popularity, he needs to act on this campaign promise that he will go against the so-called corrupt elite. And in the Philippines, that corrupt elite has always been depicted as the oligarchy. But I'd like to distinguish, and based on what the late American political scientist David Werfel distinguish between the elites of wealth and the elites of power. The so-called oligarchy is just a segment of the entire socio-economic and political ruling elite. And the ruling elite can be divided into the so-called elites of wealth, the elite, the socio-economic elite who generates power through their material possession, through the accumulation and defense of their wealth. And the so-called elites of power who accumulate power through their political position. Now, the oligarchs are simply the part of that socio-economic elite or elite of wealth. But in the Philippines, what we have seen through time is the emergence of what Nathan Kimpo calls the oligarchic elite, which is a combination of both wealth and power. Okay. Now, historically, the oligarchy is both a cause and effect of the largely inequitable economic system in the country. The oligarchy is a product of history, and it is a reflection of the intractable and somewhat unchanging landscape of Philippine economy and politics. This is what David Timberman refers to as a changeless land. And however, in my case, from my perspective, I believe the real issue is not oligarchy per se. The reason why the traditional oligarchs have managed to maintain their power through wealth accumulation and wealth defense is through rent seeking, or what is commonly known as crony capitalism or regulatory capture. From my perspective, one president's oligarchy is another president's crony. So the real issue here is crony capitalism, or the use of political connections instead of productivity to accumulate wealth and defend their material wealth. Now, this system is perpetuated in collusion with the elite of power, or the political class. And in the Philippines, the political class is largely composed of political dynasties. The Philippines has been notorious for the number of political clans and dynasties that have controlled both local and national politics. In my research, I have counted 319 political clans that have controlled local and national politics through the years, through decades, through centuries. No? And the largest number of political clans are in NCR, and the rest are scattered all over Central Luzon, Calabarzon. And notice that the concentration of political clans are largely near the capital, center of Manila. Now, 35% of political families have been active since the colonial and post-war period. And 39% of political families have emerged in the last 4 decades. Only 26% of political families are dormant and defunct. Now, based on a study conducted by the Ateneo School of Government, and I see Dean Ronald Mendoza here, as of 2016, based on their calculations, 81% of governors are from political dynasties, 78% of congressmen are for political dynasties, 69% of mayors are from political dynasties, and 57% of vice mayors are also from political dynasties. And based on their computation, by 2040, 70% of the local government officials will be dynastic. So we have here a problem, a bigger problem, no? Because the speaker, also echoing the president, calls for a change in the Philippine oligarchic system. Now, my reply to this is, if you just target 1 or 2 families and then you ignore the others, if you don't totally consider changing fundamentally what is wrong with the structure and the system, then that is not reform. That is simply partisan politics. So if the speaker or even the president are truly sincere in trying to dismantle the oligarchy in this country, they should start by actually the speaker should start in his own backyard, no? The House of Representatives, and start to pass a genuine anti-political dynasty law. Why anti-political dynasty law? What is the relationship of passing a regulation on political dynasties with the entire problem of oligarchy? Essentially, and I've repeated this time and time again, in economics, if ever there is a monopoly or an oligopoly, more often than not, this is considered to be a market failure. The same can be said about our political market, our political arena. If a handful of families have managed to control all elective and appointed positions in practically all the local governments and national position in this country, then that is an indication of what is called a political market failure. Political clans have used a variety of adaptive strategies through the years. And even within clans and dynasties, there is a circulation or a weeding out of old traditional and the emergence of new and emerging political clans. They have used through time uh, kinship relations, family, establishing political machines, mobilizing wealth and property, raiding state resources, and if all others fail, political violence. And all of these adaptive strategies have contributed to the continuing dominance of political clans in elections. And of course, this is converted into economic prospects and economic opportunities, which further feeds into their adaptive strategies. Now, the Constitution, the framers of the 1987 Constitution, uh, projected a series of reforms that were included in the Constitution. Among them is term limits. Okay, but there was another provision that was supposed to go hand in hand with term limits, and that was the anti-political dynasty law. And it was mandated in our Constitution, but 30 years hence, we still have to see Congress pass this legislation. When I was appointed by President Duterte in the Consultative Committee, I chaired the Committee on Political and Economic Reforms. And I fought strongly for the following provisions to be considered in the proposed amendments to the Constitution. One is the self-executing anti-political dynasty provision. Second, strengthening of political parties, particularly the banning of political party switching. Third is the party list reforms. And fourth, of course, the most important is the campaign finance reforms. In the interest of time, I will just walk you through what the salient points of the provisions that were approved by the CONCOM, but when it was presented to President Duterte and the House, it was totally rejected, as expected. So in the anti-political dynasty provision, it is deemed self-executing, meaning there is no need to pass a law in order for it to be in effect. And in our provision, we propose a regulation or banning of relatives running from the second degree of consanguinity or affinity, whether such relations are legitimate, illegitimate, half or full blood. Okay, so they cannot run for the same position in the immediately following election. We also propose a ban on political party switching. So if you switch parties, you will not only be fined, but you will lose your position. And we also introduce a series of campaign finance reform in which ordinary citizens can contribute to political parties of their choice with a corresponding tax credit. So these are essentially proposals that are needed to level the political playing field. And if indeed, well, of course, it is too much to ask, it is too much to expect that an institution that has benefited so much from the old ways of doing things would think of reforming that very same institution. So it is incumbent on like-minded citizens, reform-minded individuals and organizations and civil society and academia to continue in this advocacy of leveling the political playing field, and at the same time coupled with the necessary economic reforms that truly will enhance participation and democracy. because in these trying times, we should not only look at a new normal, but also we should also take this opportunity to reconfigure our entire political system so that the curse of inequality and the oligarchy will eventually be addressed. Thank you very much and a pleasant good morning to everyone.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Tehanki, for sharing those insights with us today. Before we move on with our program, I think I should introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Sorry, am I being heard? Yes. Okay. I'll introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Francisco Magno. Dr. Magno is a trustee and the convener of Strat-Based ADR Institute's governance program. He's also a senior fellow and professor at the De La Salle University. Dr. Magno, I'll turn it over to you at this point for a few questions that you may have for Dean Ron and Dr. July.
Thank you to
Dr.
my
Magno.
namesake, Francesco. Paco.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I'm Spanish, so I'm Francisco. So we have the very good presentations this morning, the first two in our panel, and they complement each other. So Dean Ron Mendoza focused on the long process of institutionalizing economic reforms. So he looked at the different reform efforts, building an independent central bank, strong treasury, instituting checks and balances, procurement reforms, and oversight mechanisms. So the risks raised by Dr. Ron Mendoza is precisely the topic this morning, is the risk posed by the COVID crisis. It's an emergency situation, and in emergency situations, there are opportunities for shortcuts. So linking this with the presentation of Dean July Tehanki, we focus on the need for political reforms. So in a way, there are risks to the economic reforms precisely because of the failure to institutionalize deep political reforms. So the issue here is that you actually have elections that can lead to the installation of leaders who would like to reverse those reforms. So let me now go to the questions. So Dr. Ron Mendoza, you said that we instituted these reforms painstakingly over a period of 20 years, and yet there are risks. Where are these risks coming from? Maybe, okay, Dr. Ron can respond later. So the risk precisely emerged from the fact that in the appointment process, the president, who is the highest elected official of the country, can actually affect the system of oversight and checks and balances. He has appointment powers to the Supreme Court, to the various institutions in the bureaucracy, and even the independent constitutional commissions, like the Commission on Elections and other commissions. But at the same time, these appointments are confirmed by the Commission on Appointments of Congress. So this leads me now to Dr. Tehanki. So Dr. Tehanki is focusing on the need for deep political reforms that basically have met a lot of obstacles from Congress, and that these reforms include the anti-dynasty law, and political party reforms, as well as campaign finance reforms. Despite term limits, you actually have a Congress elected that is quite malleable because they usually go to the political alliance built around the president. So that in fact affects the neutrality of Congress that confirms the political appointments of the president. So let me now allow our two eminent speakers to respond. So the first is to Dr. Ron Mendoza. It's about the risks to these economic reforms precisely because of elected officials who can actually challenge the institutional reforms that have been in place for so many years. And for Dr. Tihanki, it's actually the deep political reforms that are needed. But people are saying we have to live with the COVID crisis for a long time. So does it mean that we have to live with the COVID crisis? We also have to live with the political dynasties. Given the failure of Dr. Tihanki in this battle in the Constitutional Commission. Please, Dr. Mendoza and Dr. Tihanki, let us go to Dr. Mendoza first.
Okay, first let me try to correct your assessment, if I may, Kiko. Dean July's efforts is not a failure in my view. Anytime you have leaders like him advance what is right for this country, that is already a victory in and of itself. And so the fact that we are actually discussing this today and figuring out how to advance is also a good sign. So I would like to give Dean July due credit for all his efforts to try and steer that ship away from the shipwreck it became. But it was not up to Dean July alone, as we all know. I do think your question is in terms of the risks that we face right now, and we face several. But I think the research on populism in different countries is such that if you have an extreme degree of uncertainty, and if you have crises, you are actually pushed closer to strongman rule, stronger authoritarian tendencies. And this is sort of supported by various literature, including in psychology. So I think this is, again, the kind of situation we are facing, and very similar to over 30, 40 years ago, it seems to me, when we were under the dictatorship, that we are ceding more and more power to a group of leaders who are overtly actually weakening checks and balances in our democratic institutions. So ceding power to such a group may not necessarily produce the kinds of good outcomes that we all want to see. That's my main concern. And so while I support the creation of an anti-terror law, I would like to see it created in the context of strong checks and balances, not just assumed checks and balances. I think that is the paradox of our democracy today, that we would like to give our state more power to actually address the challenges we face and fuel the ambitions we all have, except that the checks and balances are actually quite weak. So we may end up producing an even worse outcome than if we were not to give our state more power. And I think that's one of the main overall risks. As far as the immediate risks, I'm seeing too many parallels with 30 years ago. That's why I read my foreword to Rick Manapat's book, Some Are Smarter Than Others. This entire discussion of ending oligarchy is not a new one. It's not even very novel. It's a rehash of old narratives. And the approach is not even new at all. As Dean July has mentioned, if you just simply replace a few of them and not the entire system that produces oligarchs, then you are basically just playing the oligarch card, but basically changing very little. As I mentioned to media, it is a merry-go-round of oligarchs, depending on who the president is occupying Malacanang. And that is a debilitating economic investment environment, to be in that system where a congressman tells you, why don't you just sell your firms if you if you really care about your workers? You're the real problem, not the firm, not the workers. This is an abuse of the regulatory powers given to the state. That is not what we wanted our state to do when it was given the power to actually review franchises. And that is going to create an environment where we are going to get less investments and the wrong kind of investments, the kinds of investments that don't care about institutions, contracts, or rule of law. So I think that's one of the big risks just sent in the past 2 to 3 weeks, if you ask me. And so I think this discussion is very, very timely. I would like to support Dean July's analysis that if there is a competition element in the economy, there's a competition element in the political side as well. And the interesting thing about Dean July's work is he sees the close links of both. The oligarchs on the political side are also now becoming oligarchs on the economic side. You don't need to be transactional about it anymore, Dean July. You can own the business and also become senator, and also become president, and also become congressman. That is a very dangerous situation, and it is rife with conflict of interest, as I have explained to media. You cannot regulate sectors where you own vast amounts of that sector and pretend that it doesn't matter. And I think that's the wrong signal we're sending to foreign investors. Fortunately, we have passed reforms, the many reforms that I mentioned in my brief intervention, but also the creation of the Competition Authority. And I fully support Chairman Balisacan and his colleagues there to really comment and provide oversight on our crisis response, because the inability of our state to protect our firms and to protect our workers may create a fire sale of firms, may create a fire sale of several sectors in the economy, ripe for consolidation, which will produce less competition, not more. If you ask me, in certain sectors, that is certainly what may result. And so I think that's another concern of mine in terms of what the COVID and COVID aftermath environment will look like. My final concern is actually, and I'll end with this thought, it's a rather chilling thought. Hong Kong decided that it will defer its elections for 1 year. And again, in a period of uncertainty, in a period of weakness, the consolidation of power by the state, there is a tendency for citizens to actually support this. And COVID seems to be giving opportunities to populists and would-be authoritarians to take advantage of the situation. I really think we should not give in to that kind of a narrative, because what we need now is not a ceding of more power, but an increase in accountability in responses. Otherwise, we will end up ceding more and more power with less and less effective results. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Dr. July.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kiko. I'll just keep my my comments brief because I have a class in a couple of minutes. So moving forward, no, while the COVID pandemic crisis has provided an opportunity for populists and strongmen all over the world to consolidate power and use that power not really to address the public health crisis, but to advance their own interests, we are also seeing a pushback all over the world. So it's also providing an opportunity for ordinary citizens to see the weakness of these populist strongmen, because these strongmen are, the crisis have revealed that they are not capable of addressing, they do not have the competence in addressing the crisis, despite all the powers that they have accumulated for themselves. So now we are seeing populists from Trump to our very own grappling on how to handle this pandemic. Third, because of this, a lot more of sectors in society are already waking up to the reality that this is not how the crisis should be addressed, and this is not the kind of post-COVID future that we want for ourselves. So the more these strongmen demonstrate bluster instead of competence, the more citizens are, would realize that this is not how it should be. And we have last point regarding elections in 2022. There are efforts to postpone that election. There are efforts to push for the term limits to be abolished, no? And there are efforts to really extend, no? Instead of introducing genuine political electoral reforms, the interest of our politicians is to extend their terms. So, but at the same time, there are talks among political campaigners and political consultants that elections, the very nature of elections, might change, no? Because of COVID, no? Because of the digital nature of interaction nowadays. So it would be difficult for machine politicians now to access resource and distribute it to their local machines because of the COVID situation. And that provides an opportunity for new entrants who are smart enough to leverage on digital technology in order to equally combat these traditional political families and friends. So these are my views in the post-COVID politics. Thank you.
Thank you, July. We will have a last round of questions from our audience. So I'll be reading some of these questions. I understand you two are very busy. So before you go to your class, maybe you can take time to respond to this. From Nick Leofe to Dr. Tihanki, what kinds of reforms do we need to improve our country's party list system? In strengthening our political parties, what is the ideal number of political parties and why? July, before you respond, because there is a series of questions here. From Gary Olivar, Dean July is far from failure. I actually agree with that. The Bayanihan Constitution he helped to draft was further updated by an executive branch, IATF, whose output is now pending with the cabinet. Meanwhile, the key reforms he drafted continue to be pushed through the constitutional reforms movement of various CSOs that is strongly supported by DILG. We have Dr. Raul Fabella. For Ron and July, is oligarchy always anti-progress? The robber barons were good for the USA. President Duterte used oligarchs and Drilon also, but the meanings were different or same? That's a question. The term has no common definition required for scientific discourse. Okay, there are other questions here. So,
Okay.
Go ahead, Dean July. Ikaw na muna.
Okay, yes, please.
Okay. The number of parties cannot be legislated. No, it is a function of the electoral system that you choose. So if you choose to elect through a majoritarian system, then essentially that will lead to a two-party system. But if you choose a proportional system, then that would lead to a multi-party system. No, so but there are of course hybrid systems. No, you cannot legislate a party system. That's very basic in political science. What kind of reforms? Of course, we all know that the political party list system in the Philippines was originally intended to provide an avenue, albeit narrow avenue, for the marginalized and the poor. And in recent years, it has become populated by members of political clans as well. The problem has been in the implementation, in the interpretation, and the judicial interventions that have emerged in recent years that have muddled the real concept of party list representation in this country. But I am against any attempt to abolish, because I see that it is a way by which sectors and the marginalized can be represented. So we have also formulated a series of reforms that should be introduced in the party list system. I'd like to thank Secretary Gary Olivar also for his kind words. I've worked with them also, and I consider myself still working with them in pushing for these reforms. When it comes to the advocacy of all these reforms, I'm politically colorblind, so I can work with anyone, and I hope to work with anyone to push these advocacies. There were so many questions, I couldn't remember. So, sige Ron, ikaw muna.
Yeah,
let
me get very briefly to Prof. Raul Fabelia's quick question on robber barons in the United States and whether oligarchs can also be helpful. Thanks, Prof. Raul, for following this discussion. And of course, it's an honor to respond to your question. I follow Prof. Raul's work on conglopolistic competition. This is an idea he's been developing recently to basically analyze whether even in the existence of conglomerates, you can still have a more or less healthy degree of competition and temper the rent-seeking sort of pressure on the economy. And I wonder whether that is applicable to the economic sector, but not necessarily applicable to the political sector because of the types of public good objectives that they have as political leaders. I also wonder whether in places like in East Asia, where you have large conglomerates that at least according to the literature, contributed to economic development and inclusive growth in these countries, whether it was mostly because they were forced to go out and compete in the international arena. You needed to export a Samsung phone, you needed to export a Hyundai to the United States, you needed to export a Toyota to Western markets and all over the world. Whereas in our case, very few conglomerates have actually been forced to go out and compete and generate jobs for us. And I think this is one of the areas where size should have been driving export market growth and innovation rather than being focused on rent-rich areas in the Philippines, such as development of land, development of malls, and development of properties, and perhaps even some utilities. This is the big divergence between our large business elite and their large business elite. And of course, since Prof. Raul is a very able historian and follows the US example, as I understand it, they did have robber barons who were focused on internal infrastructure development, such as railroads. I watched on Netflix the other day one of these series where it explains that the robber barons actually got most of their wealth because of the land grants they were given in exchange for developing the infrastructure. So I think part of what we may be seeing in other countries that is good is when you are geared towards sectors that are more competitive, that requires more competition. Whereas if you are stuck in sectors that are rent rich, then you stay with the rent seeking game and actually go to the politicians and sort of try to capture it in this way. So I think that's the big evolution that is good for industrializing countries that we are still seeking in our country.
Thank you, Ron. Maybe we can just address these last few questions before July goes to his class. So from Rolly Talampas, where are the external actors, partners of the oligarchy? From Diwa Quinones, what strategic moves should the COMELEC pursue to try to guarantee credible elections? And from Chris Miranda, do you think the administration will still push with charter change? So maybe July 1st and then Ron.
Yeah, maybe quick answers po para Dr. July, who's on mute now, can go to class also.
What's the second question, Dr. Kiko? Can you please repeat?
The moves that the COMELEC should take to guarantee credible elections.
Oh, well, I am not privy to what they're doing at the COMELEC, but first of all, they have to fix the automated system. I think it's a question of trust and credibility, and they have to reconsider the technology that they're using and the service provider. So we entrust our money with ATMs, and yet we cannot entrust our votes with the vote counting machines. No? So I think it's more of a question of credibility and trust rather than the technology.
The question from Chris Miranda, I think you can answer. Will the administration push for charter change?
It's still up in the air. We're not sure because apparently our congressmen are busy with a lot of other things except handling the pandemic. No, so I'm not really sure if it will push through.
Okay, the last question: external actors and partners of the oligarchy. And I think Ron can also address that.
Yeah.
So July,
so I leave that.
You can go to your class.
Thank you.
So the external partners, will you answer that? I think he left. So maybe Ron, can you answer that question?
Kiko, I was hoping Dean July would be in the hot seat instead of me. That's probably the toughest question of the three. We are concerned of external influence. We have always been concerned with external influence from the very beginning because of our history, right? But now, most especially because of the advent of new technologies and the growth of increasing growth of evidence and literature that, there are interventions in elections that actually distort or at least have the power of distorting outcomes. So this is something to watch out for. And going back to one of your questions, what do we need to do to prepare for elections? I think what we need to do is start working immediately to protect our May 2022 elections and prepare for it rather than start too late, which is going to then leave a good deal of uncertainty, which is not good for our politics nor for our economy. And so I raised this issue that Hong Kong decided to delay its elections. This is very, very troubling and is certainly not going to be good for the institutions building trajectory of Hong Kong, a country that, a territory that has managed to develop quite fast and yet now finds itself in a position to delay elections and delay the key accountability mechanism applied by citizens on their leaders. And if that fails, then basically all other institutions in a democracy will then be up for query. So I do think that we need to support COMELEC, immediately raise the issues of preparing for May 2022. There's a lot to do, including, by the way, the BARM elections. And I think that's a good question and an issue to raise immediately.
Thank you, Ron. So those are two excellent presentations by Dr. Ron Mendoza and Dr. July Tiangui. Thank you very much. So back to you, Paco.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Magno. Thank you, Dean Ron, and of course to Dr. July, who's now off in class. That was a very interesting discussion there. Thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Rizal Buendia. Rizal Buendia is a non-resident fellow at Strat-based ADRi Institute, and he actually recently authored a paper for the Institute on the continuing political development and national state building in the Philippines. Unfortunately, Dr. Buendia is on the opposite side of the world and is probably fast asleep right now. So he instead sent us a video that we'll be playing for you right now, where he discusses some of the ideas from his paper that are in line with our discussion today. Here we go.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I wish to thank the Strat-based Albert Del Rosario Institute, particularly its founder and managing director, Professor Dindo Manhit, for having me in this valuable webinar. Much to my desire to deliver my piece live, the 7-hour difference between Manila and the UK makes it difficult for me to wake up and virtually be with you, as it would be 2:30 in the morning when my slot comes to speak. The theme of today's forum indeed is apropos given the continuing challenges the country faces in its enduring task to national development and nation building. Given the limited time I have, I will focus my presentation on the systemic pathology of Philippine political development and tasks to be done as a nation. The study of political development has its roots in the 1950s, and the use of the term political development evolved over the past 7 decades. The vast study of political development
Sure ba ako? Sir Paco, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Is the video of Dr. Buendia over? Okay.
Nah,
Sorry, what was that, John? Can you help me out here a bit?
technical difficulties on the video.
Technical difficulties on the video. Sorry about that. In that case, let's just move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Ayami Suzuki. Professor Suzuki is a professor of the Faculty of Law at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan, and she's now a visiting professor at the Department of Political Science at the De La Salle University. And she had a very interesting article recently on the Philippines' response to COVID-19 limits of state capacity. So we're interested to hear more from Professor Suzuki. Hi, good morning. Good morning, po.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It is such a great honor to be with many respected speakers. Let me share my screen. I hope it works. Unlike the previous speakers, I will focus more on the short-term consequences of the COVID-19 response. It should be legitimized, I believe, because the respective government's response to the health crisis clearly reveals the capacity of the state and the nature of institutions of respective countries. About half and a month ago, I published a short piece on the Philippine response to COVID-19. Actually, it was my first piece on the Philippine politics. In this short piece, I argued that the state capacity of the Philippines is quite limited because of the limited financial response, slow and uneven implementation of the social amelioration program, and the significant presence of the private sector in public goods provisions, such as building and managing of the quarantine center. To think further about the capacity of the state, I recently started a comparison with other countries, especially ASEAN 4. I started from the case of Malaysia because I am more familiar with the country. I've been writing about Malaysia for more than 10 years for now. And I found out the comparison between Malaysia and the Philippines as quite interesting. Why compare two countries in the first place? First, both countries introduced similar measures against COVID almost at the same time. ECQ in the Philippines from March 17, and the movement control order in Malaysia from March 18. And both countries also introduced financial measures about 10 days after ECQ and MCO. The regulations, as in shown in the table, are more or less the same. Only essential services were allowed to operate, gatherings and movements were prohibited except for selected reasons. However, the trajectory of COVID infection is very different. This graph shows daily new cases in the Philippines in red and Malaysia in green lines. The number of new cases in the two countries were pretty close in the encircled period, which is from mid-March to mid-April. But the two countries dramatically parted ways after mid-April. The same can be seen in this graph, which shows the number of active cases. The consequences seem to be very different so far. The Philippines' total number of cases is more than 10 times bigger than that of Malaysia. For your information, the Philippines population is about 3 times bigger than that of Malaysia. And the recovery rate in the Philippines seems to be far below that of Malaysia. Likewise, the impact of the lockdown measures seem to be very different. This is Philippines' curve. Green line is cumulative cases, purple is recoveries, orange is death. The curve of cumulative cases, which is shown in green, becomes much steeper and steeper after ECQ. On the other hand, this is Malaysia. The green line, which is cumulative cases, became flatter as the lockdown eased by phase. CMCO here means conditional MCO, and RMCO is recovery MCO. With almost all sectors, economic sectors are open and also schools are open, of course with strict health procedures, protocols. And lastly, economic performance are quite different as well. First quarter GDP growth for the year in the Philippines contracted by 0.2%, whereas Malaysia managed to record a positive growth. And if you look at the unemployment rate, Philippines has much higher unemployment rate and also recorded a bigger dip from the previous period. Now, similar lockdown, but different trajectories and consequences. How can we explain this? I understand that the spread of virus depends on multiple factors, which are now being discussed among scientists all over the world. And also Malaysia and Philippines are quite different in terms of size of population as well as population density, which I think is pretty important. However, we can also assume that the state intervention makes differences. So in this presentation, I would like to focus on the 3 areas of state's function in the COVID-19 response, namely regulation and enforcement, public health administration, and economic management and distribution. As all the speakers today are much more knowledgeable about the Philippine situation than myself, so I will focus solely on Malaysia from now on. I hope Malaysia's case will provide some insights into the institutional capacity of the Philippines. Now, this graph shows new cases in Malaysia, daily fresh cases. Roughly speaking, there are 2 peaks. One starts from mid-March, another in mid-May to early June. The first peak is mainly attributed to a religious gathering called Tabligh Jemaat in a mosque in Kuala Lumpur. The participants included Muslims from Malaysia and the neighboring countries, and also numbers of Rohingya refugees who stayed in Malaysia were included. How did the government control the situation? The most important element here is the rigorous contact tracing. The chart is from the Ministry of Health, showing the cases. The red one is new cases, the newly found cases, but it's a little bit old file from 14. Anyway, it's a file from March. For this purpose, more than 42,000 individuals were screened, including the participants and the close contacts. And this cluster eventually grew to have 3,375 cases, which accounts for 38% of the total case in Malaysia. And it also resulted in 17 subclusters. However, with the intervention by the Health Ministry, the cluster declared to have ended on July 8. Of course, this is not the only cluster, as is shown in the second wave. This is not exactly second wave, the second peak. It's largely clusters among foreign workers and immigration detention center. Those are the migrants without a valid document. So there are, roughly speaking, there are two peaks. Facing these two peaks, the Malaysian government did rigorous, intensive contact tracing, but aside from it, they did what they call as a active case detection or surveillance. For instance, as I said, number of tabligh gathering participants found to be COVID positive. So the Health Ministry did a screening in the religious schools because number of the tabligh participants were teachers in the religious schools. The government did screening in the religious schools all over the country. By mid-May, the government did more than 12,000 tests in these schools and then found 635 positive cases. The same goes with the second peak of the cases, which is largely the foreign workers and then the undocumented migrants in KL and the surrounding areas. So the government also did the same approach with the detention centers and the construction sites in KL, which have many foreign workers. The important thing here is that these public health responses were led by bureaucracy. The table on the left shows who issued the press statement between mid-February to late March. Different colors indicate different persons. You can see the table is predominantly green. It is the Director General of Health, Dr. Noor Hisham, as is captured in the photo. There were days when the Deputy Prime Minister or the Minister of Health issued statement, but basically it's Dr. Noor who took over and appeared on TV every day and gave updates to the people. His scientific explanation was pretty much well received by the people. Dr. Noor is a surgeon who was appointed as a Deputy Director General of Health in 2008 and then held the current position since 2013. A professional bureaucrat, not a politician, was instrumental in the public health response. Why could the bureaucrats be in charge? One thing is that Malaysia's health ministry already had the capacity of contact tracing and surveillance due to the past experience in SARS. But at the same time, there was an environment that created a kind of space for the bureaucrats' leadership. In fact, Malaysia had a political vacuum for about 2 weeks. On February 23, some members of government parties and opposition parties gathered at the Shelton Hotel near KL and agreed on toppling the government. The next day, then Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad declared his resignation and was appointed as an interim Prime Minister. A week later, Muhyiddin Yassin, the current Prime Minister, was appointed as a new Prime Minister because the king believed that he had the majority support in the parliament. In other words, the new government was not chosen by the people. Naturally, the government had low democratic legitimacy. It was only on March 10 that the new health minister was appointed. He's a doctor, but he said on TV that COVID can be flushed by drinking warm water and was widely discredited. So after that, for only short period, he appeared on the daily updates, but after that, he disappeared from the press conference. So for more than 2 weeks, Ministry of Health and other ministries did not have mini starts. So there was no political leadership. However, some important decisions were made during this time. For instance, the Technical Working Committee for COVID-19 cluster meeting, which comprised of several agencies, including the Ministry of Health, had several meetings and then made important decisions such as travel ban. Now, let me look at regulation and enforcement. Regulation and enforcement was governed by the National Security Council, made up of Prime Minister, Defense Minister, and other ministers, and Chief of Defense and Inspector General of Police. NSC actually is a draconian organization. The power of NSC is defined by NSC Act 2015. The law even gives power to the state security forces to arrest without warrant. The strict nature of enforcement is shown in the number of arrests. The photo is Defense Minister Ismail Sabri Yaacob, who gave daily updates on the overall situation of the infection, as well as the record of implementation of the MCO. The table on the left is the extract from the media updates by the Defense Ministry. According to this record, 96,981 vehicles were inspected on this day, June 26, and 17 people were arrested. The graph on the right side shows the number of arrests from mid-April to the end of the MCO. Some values were missing. In all, 24,081 people were arrested. The strictness or thoroughness of the enforcement is also shown in the arrest of these three people. The people in the current slides are, from the left, daughter of the president of the biggest governing party, UMNO, deputy health minister in the middle, and an executive committee member of the state of Perak. So they were all in the governing party camps or the relative of the governing parties, but they were all found to have violated the rules, arrested, prosecuted, and found guilty. It is also important to note that the arrest of these people also indicate the fair application of the rules. The rule applies irrespective of who you are. Finally, let me examine states' capacity in the economic management and distribution. I won't go into detail, but there are 4 stimulus packages announced after the MCO, during and after the MCO, totaling about $70 billion in all. The biggest of all is called Prihatin Rakyat Economic Stimulus Package, which is worth about 250 billion ringgit Malaysia. The package is directed to 3 purposes: protect people's welfare, support businesses, mostly SMEs, and strengthen the economy, small and big infrastructural projects. Here are some selected items. It includes cash assistance for the B40 and a part of M40 people. The bottom of 40 even has another package called Bantuan Sara Hidup. And also there is another package for the B40 COVID patients. Special allowances were given to the medical and non-medical frontliners. I think it is the same in the Philippines as well. Rental waiver, deferment of loan, utility subsidy, and food security were also important pillars. For instance, Malaysians got 15 to 50% electricity bill discounts and was given free internet services during MCO. The wage subsidy was also a very important program. It was basically targeted to our lower income employees, but for up to 3 months, but on the condition that the employers would not retrench the employees. And then there are other packages for SMEs, soft loan, and then digitalization loans, also boosting domestic investment, such as small infrastructural projects and mega infrastructure projects. Before launching the Prihatin package, Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin announced that the government will give attention to everyone, whether they're small traders, taxi drivers, farmers, fishermen, livestock breeders, factory workers, private sector employees, or civil servants. I think if you look at the package, it looks like he actually did give attention to everyone. Now, this is the reaction of the public so far. The Department of Statistics had 2 surveys on the impact of the impact of COVID as well as the PHILIPPINE package. The right side is a summary of the survey on the individuals. The summary shows that 70.1% found PHILIPPINE as effective and 9.1% found it highly effective. And then almost all the respondents was the beneficiary of at least one program in the package. Now, let me summarize Malaysia's COVID response. Hard lockdown with strict and fair implementation was definitely one of the keys. But the government did not forget to ensure there is a sufficient cash aid, cash flows to the individuals and companies. I think this gave people incentive to stay at home, which resulted in higher compliance. While imposing lockdown, the health ministry did rigorous contact tracing and active detection of cases, and eventually succeeded in control and suppress infection. I think it is safe to say that Malaysia's case, institutional capacity of the state mattered much. Malaysian state was equipped with capacities to strictly and fairly enforce rules, secure public health, and mobilize resources for economic relief and stimulus. Of course, as I mentioned in enforcement, democratic legitimacy of the government still remains in question, so is the power of National Security Council. But we may be able to say that the government with weak democratic legitimacy and weak popular support at least succeeded in merit-based legitimacy due to the institutional capacity in health administration and also rule enforcement. Now, is Philippines equipped with this institution and institutional capacity? With this question, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Suzuki. A very interesting presentation, and that insight, also that comparative insight on Malaysia and the Philippines response. Okay, that said, we have our next speaker up. Our next speaker is Professor Danilo Arao. Professor Arao is a professor at the Department of Journalism, the College of Mass Communications at the University of the Philippines. And he'll be focusing today on the invaluable roles of an engaged civil society and independent media in upholding transparency and accountability and nation building. Professor Arao, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paco. Can the
Welcome.
participants see the PowerPoint the slide presentation?
We can. Making media matter.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, so good morning to all of you. I defer, of course, to the expertise of our experts in political science and public administration to talk about the political dynamics happening right now amid the COVID-19 pandemic. So our focus right now would be on media, making media matter, as if media doesn't matter at all. But of course, as you all know, there are various debates as to how media should play a role given the COVID-19 pandemic. Should it just follow rules and regulations by government? Should it not assert basic freedoms at a time when there are certain threats, not just to press freedom, but to the most basic freedoms that we're holding on right now? So much of that will be discussed later on, but for now, allow me to just provide a run-through of infodemic amid the pandemic. Okay, I'm going to the next slide now. What's happening? Okay, here. So infodemic amid the pandemic. So as you all know, infodemic as a term is relatively new. It's a portmanteau or a blend of information and epidemic, courtesy of David Rothkopf, a columnist of the Washington Post. Basically, infodemic refers to the rapid spread of information. It's a mix of reliable and unreliable information, truth and fake news to a broad audience. So the information crisis that we have right now could be rooted in the infodemic that is happening. It's fake news versus the truth. Actually, to quote from the United Nations during the celebration of World Press Freedom Day last May 3, as the pandemic spreads, it has also given rise to a second pandemic of misinformation, from harmful health advice to wild conspiracy theories. And right now, the United Nations uses the word antidote. The press provides the antidote courtesy of scientific, fact-based news and analysis. So what information crisis do we refer to right now? We are faced with too many acronyms. Don't get me wrong, there should be nothing wrong with acronyms. People are intelligent enough to be used to such terms. But if we couple it with the other factors, that would be harder to absorb. For example, lockdown would suffice. And as early as May, you would remember that President Duterte admitted that he wanted to use the word lockdown, but for one reason or the other, he was somewhat overruled by some officials because quarantine is a better term to use in addressing a health issue. Now, aside from having too many acronyms, there's also a refusal to use certain nomenclatures. Mass testing as a term is used worldwide. It's even used by the World Health Organization. But what the government wants would be expanded targeted testing, under the assumption that if it's mass testing, people will allegedly be led to believe that it would cover all of the population, even if the running average worldwide would be from 2% to 3% of the total population being tested. There are also changes in taxonomy that resulted in the confusion of people, especially when reading data from the Department of Health. If you would recall, in April 2020, there was a change from PUM and PUI, people under monitoring, people under investigation, to 3 classifications: suspect, probable, and confirmed cases. So there was confusion as early as that time. And then a month later, you have the disaggregation of data from new cases to quote-unquote fresh and late cases. And just last month, fresh and late cases as classifications have been removed to highlight only the active cases in the presentation of the epidemiological curve. Now, it's not just an issue of information crisis. We also have problems with regard to the actual message. Sometimes you would have misleading information. One example would be the one that was said by Undersecretary Martin Dino to the effect that there are no more human rights during the state of emergency. So, and there was also a suspension of the writ of habeas corpus given the lockdown. Of course, he was roundly criticized by the Commission on Human Rights as well as other cause-oriented groups regarding such remarks. And of course, who can forget the use of disinfectant uttered by President Duterte himself just recently. So July 22, he said that. And then July 23, the spokesperson mentioned that the president was just joking. And then July 31, just a few days ago, he said that he wasn't joking. Although, of course, we have to be fair with regard to analyzing the statement, because apparently Duterte was referring to gasoline or diesel as disinfectant way back in July 22. But in July 31, if you listen closely to Duterte's statement, he wasn't referring to gasoline or diesel. He was referring to kerosene because he used the term gaas, okay, which in the Filipino language would refer to kerosene. But whether or not it's kerosene, diesel, or gasoline, we all know that there is no scientific basis for saying that these are actually disinfectants. Now, in analyzing the messaging of some of our government officials, it would be good to try to subject it to scientific scrutiny. We all know that Senator Coco Pimentel has been bashed on social media, has been widely criticized for breaching the safety protocol, but we can further quantify the disillusion of people, excuse me, regarding the actuation of Senator Coco Pimentel by actually studying his statement. If you look at the frequency of the words used, out of more than 300 words in the statement that he released, 33 referred to I, me, and my. So it's very self-serving, self-centered, if you may, depending on how you analyze it. And then if you look at the readability, there is a scientific basis for using readability. Some of us have taken it in our high school and college days. It's called the Flesch Reading Ease and the Flesch Kincaid grade level. The statement by itself, even if it's written in English and many of the words there are quite understandable, the sentence was constructed in a way that it's fairly difficult to read. Because as you all know, in order for a statement to be easy to read, the reading ease should be at the grade of 80. And the grade level should be that of a sixth grader, okay, not the grade level of 10. So we don't have much time to go through the computation of reading ease, but as we all know, it all boils down to the number of number of words per sentence, the length of the paragraphs, not to mention the words that you used. It should be about 3 syllables or more, or fewer, 3 syllables or fewer. At any rate, we don't want to go into the technicals here, but the bottom line is that even with the way we've analyzed the statement in a quantifiable manner, there is still that element of self-centeredness, and we can see here empirical proof of how people get disillusioned consciously or unconsciously by the statements that are uttered by some of our officials. Now, of course, when you analyze certain misleading claims by some of our public figures or government officials, we must also be wary of how they package the messages. For example, if you go to a highly respected doctor like Dr. Edsel Salvana, even if that particular tweet has a lot of data, 158 new cases as of April 5, 2020, there are choices of words there that would be that would contribute to the misleading claim. Really seems, real effect. And if you look at the length of that particular sentence, it's relatively too long. And while it's within the 280 character word limit 280 character limit on Twitter, there's a way to still revise the statement so that it can be better understood. So the probable revision or the editing notes that I put there would be somewhat easy to understand. The same case with Teddy Boy Locsin. Sometime in April 2018, he ended up posting something that is fake news. To be fair to Secretary Locsin, he said, and he admitted that this is fake news. Just ignore the expletive that he used. But it's good that he quickly acknowledged it and he assumes responsibility, albeit implicitly. But the negative side there is that even if you look at the tweet, no matter how short it is, he does not publicly apologize and he shows no remorse for what he has done. And part of ethics in social media, if you make a mistake, you have to make a promise that you will not do it again. So this is not a responsible way to post an erratum on social media. And writing, of course, sentences in all caps should be avoided, especially by a public official like him. And of course, cursing in public should be avoided because it fails to raise the level of discourse. Now, the ideal, rhetorical, and the actual should also be better appreciated. But before we go to that, we should also mention the incidents of fake news among certain sectors in the Philippine National Police. It has been quite notorious for posting uh, claims of certain legal organizations being fronts, allegedly, of the Communist Party of the Philippines. So red baiting, as we all know, is a real threat, not just to the livelihood of certain individuals, but to their very lives. You may be subject to arrest, detention, or even extrajudicial killing. So that would partly explain why, in an ideal setting, we should be following the protocols set by the World Health Organization regarding mass testing, contact tracing, and isolation and treatment. But what's happening right now in terms of rhetoric of the government would be different. Okay, so it doesn't want mass testing, but it wants expanded and targeted testing. Through contact tracing, what government resorts to would be increased military and police visibility. And there was even criticism about the use of the so-called chismosas or rumor mongers among certain communities as police assets. And of course, this all boils down to threats against violators. Instead of isolation and treatment, you have detention and maltreatment resulting from such threats. And we are seeing the reality where even harmless posts on social media, no matter how critical they may be, could result in invitations from the National Bureau of Investigation. And there was even a threat of deportation of an OFW who posted a critical commentary on social media. So that's the reality right now with regard to the media landscape and the exercise of freedom of expression among ordinary people. So on top of that, we see attacks against the media. Now, there are a lot of data that we can get regarding incidents of attack coming from the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Sans Frontier, Freedom House, National Union of Journalists, and the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility also have their own studies regarding the prevailing culture of impunity in the country right now. This data that I'm presenting here comes from Freedom for Media, Freedom for All Coalition. This is the latest so far. So from June 30, 2016 to April 30, 2020, we see a lot of cases of attacks and threats against the press. During the lockdown, we see the attacks against ABS-CBN, the denial of ransom, as well as the cyber libel conviction of Maria Ressa and Ray Santos of Rappler, as well as the confiscation of copies of Pinoy Weekly by the Philippine National Police, allegedly for containing subversive content. I should also mention here that the data presented by Freedom for All, Freedom for Media was April 30, but there was a journalist killed on May 5. His name is Cornelio Pepino of Dumaguete City. He was killed on the same day that ABS-CBN was closed. So the actual number of journalists and media workers killed under the Duterte administration is now actually 16, not 15, as seen on the screen right now. So how do we make media matter the most? So of course, we have to still assert press freedom because we have to defend it at a time when it's being threatened. There's a need, of course, to end the culture of impunity. And as mentioned by the previous speakers, there is a reign of authoritarianism right now. So opposing the reign of tyranny would be foremost in the agenda. Just like the time of martial law from 1972 to 1986, where it became the ethical obligation of journalists and media workers to assert press freedom, because you cannot exercise responsible journalism if there is no freedom to begin with. So just to end, these are two of the major references I used for this presentation if you want further reading. So the first one refers to the use of the word infodemic so that we can properly appreciate the concept of infodemic. And the second has to do with the stand of the United Nations regarding fake news and the role of media during the COVID-19 global pandemic. That's all. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Danny. That's very interesting and different from what we're used to hearing, different perspective from what we're used to hearing usually here during our events. Before we segue to our speakers from the civil society, from CSOs, we wanted to try again to show you the video of Dr. Buendia, which we encountered some technical difficulties with earlier. So if you will indulge us, we will again attempt to play the video. Thank you. But I don't hear anything. It seems it's the audio now.
Much to my desire to deliver my piece live, the 7-hour difference between Manila and the UK makes it difficult for me to wake up and virtually be with you, as it would be 2:30 in the morning when my slot comes to sleep. The theme of today's forum indeed is apropos given the continuing challenges the country faces in its enduring task to national development and nation building. Given the limited time I have, I will focus my presentation on the systemic pathology of Philippine political development and tasks to be done as a nation. The study of political development has its roots in the 1950s, and the use of the term political development evolved over the past 7 decades. The fast study of political development gave rise to its multiple definitions and relate to the social, economic, and cultural dimensions of society. The concept implies that all the underdeveloped countries will have to follow the same path which the developed countries had passed through. It is defined in various ways. One conceptual formulation deals with the creation and recreation of national sovereignty and exertion of nation and state building. Another is the fashionable view towards democratization, participation, and modernization through the exercise of freedom of association and expression. And more recently, good governance, rule of law, and the development of civil society. Additionally, political development touches not just on formal and constitutional and organizational arrangements, but also on such informal institutions as actual political relationships. For example, patron-clientelism. Thus, changes in attitudes and political culture are relevant too. In my 53-page paper, I trace Philippine political development as reflected in its colonial and post-colonial past. The country's continuing endeavor to chisel out its national and political advancement is contingent and cannot be divorced from its quest for and vision of national identity and sense of nationhood. I argue that the country's political development rests on its ability to transcend the inchoate sense of nationhood and consciousness, rise above the traditional politicians' dynastic control of the electoral system, and go beyond the less inclusive governance. Unless structural political and electoral reforms leading to a more empowered government structure, democratized electoral system, and participative governance are consistently and unswervingly instituted, society would consequently steer towards political decay and insulate the nation state from the people it serves. Political history and politics in the Philippines have been marked by powerful continuities and discontinuities, witnessed by both periods of development and regression. Post-colonial governments ruled through the processes and institutions bequeathed by the former colonizer were utilized not to expand the democratic space and enlarge the participation of people, but serve the economic and political interests of more powerful sector of society. Patterned after the American government, the institutions and systems of governance were unable to generally shore up the nation from post-war poverty, economic independence, and mass democracy. Although auspiciously in the last 14 years, the World Bank estimates that poverty rates in the country had declined from 26.6% in 2006 to 21.6% in 2015 and 16.6% in 2018, the country has not improved its rank in terms of Human Development Index among remains fifth between 1990 and 2018 in spite of its 20.6 percentage improvement in its HDI. On the electoral system, while several endeavors to reform and modernize it have been done, electoral improvements have to be accomplished in conjunction with the alteration of the current social, economic, and political iniquities. The flawed electoral system, beset with procedural problems, has been taken advantage by the political elites and privileged class to safeguard political and economic power that further entrench patron-client relationships. Elections have not become as yet as effective means of expressing people's sovereignty in choosing their political leaders. While democracy is inconceivable without elections, elections alone are not guarantee for democratic rule. Put differently, one cannot be a Democrat without supporting elections, but one can very well conduct elections without being a Democrat. The challenges and threats to political stability and legitimacy under a democratic regime remain real rather than imaginary. The instruments of political legitimacy, the electoral party list systems, are yet to evolve as operative mechanisms in articulating people's aspirations and support for the current political system. The nation, rather than be unified through the instrumentalities of the state, has been torn apart. The state has alienated itself from the people as corruption, centralization of power, and elitism have been unabated from the Third to Fifth Republic, covering nearly 75 years under 11 presidents, excluding the current one. The centralism of the state stands as one of the major impediments in realizing effective and responsive governance. The intense and infrequently personal nature and character of national politics has largely contributed to the growing corrosion of political institutions. Measures and movements toward greater autonomy must be placed within the context of political reform. Reform in Philippine governance necessitates the broadening of democracy, empowerment, and popular participation, thus increasing the role of civil society within and outside of existing institutions. Powerful clans and political dynasties continue to hold power. Dynasties linger to be feature of the country's political landscape. They have not been dismantled in spite of the constitutional provisions to prohibit them, considering that the requirement that a law is passed, which is defined the details of its proscription, inasmuch as both members of the Congress are direct beneficiaries of political dynasties, it is unimaginable that such law would be promulgated in the near future. Patrimonial politics has been exacerbated. People's economic deprivation has deepened, and political and social conflicts have sharpened. The country's experience has shown national will manifested in the 1986 and 2001 People Power Revolutions is capable of unleashing indomitable strength that can bring about what seems to be a formidable power of state down to its knees. The victory of the People Power Revolutions, nonetheless, does not ensure that economic and political problems would be addressed. The process of rebuilding the nation and consolidating the power of state is far more difficult than the extra constitutional seizure of power. Public officials persist to consider government funds as potential source of self-enrichment. and the bureaucracy as an enterprise to be staffed by relatives and friends. Rent-seeking is more predominant than making legitimate profit. It is thought that the best way to generate wealth is to take it from someone else or from the institutions of government rather than producing it themselves. Max Weber's concept of democracy, bureaucracy as an institution that delivers public goods and services in an impersonal and rational manner, bounded by rules and regulations and staffed by competent and committed employees, seems an alien doctrine, if not simply an academic discourse. Corruption in government is not only prevalent, but also unabated. Among the 10 ASEAN countries, the Philippines is the fourth most corrupt as per Transparency International's 2019 index. This rank does not change since 1998, when other countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand had improved considerably and had overtaken the Philippines in terms of corruption index. In the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index for 2019, the Philippines slid down one notch lower to 54th place out of 165 independent states and 2 territories. The enduring challenge of political development in the country, as I see it, is principally threefold. One is drawing a unified approach in bringing together various ethnic, religious, and national groups into the Philippine nation state. A more appropriate and long-term structural and institutional reforms in the country's political administrative system is essential. There is a need to reshape the country's political edges to accommodate differences in the country's diverse people in culture, ethnicity, and religion. This could be done either through restructuring the Philippine unitary state into a federal state or approximating the highly devolved system of government like the UK, where devolution is asymmetric, in that different parts of the UK have different forms of devolution and varying degrees of power. The 4-nation state, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all possess executive and legislative devolution, while metro mayors in parts of England and the mayor of London have only executive powers. 2 is to combine political stability with political liberalization and democratization. Political liberalization advances economic growth and development rather than contributes to political instability. The substantial empowerment of the people in the political, economic, and social affairs of society will eventually be manifested in economic development and progress. And 3, the transforming of political culture and actual relationships to a more egalitarian, less hierarchical, and further symmetrical relationships between groups of political actors is a critical process in rejigging the substructure of the nation state. It is relevant in political development as it is likewise concerned with informal institutions, not only in formal constitutional and organizational arrangements. The demands for better governance that began in the country's popular people power uprising have yet to be fulfilled after 36 years. Its realization is contingent on the restructuring of Philippine political institutions that would ensure that democratic space is enlarged through a more inclusive and participative governance, more representative electoral system, and deeper national consciousness and a sense of a nation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Buendia, all the way in the UK. Glad that that video worked this time around. Okay, next up, next in our program, we have some of our friends and partners from civil society. First up, we have Mr. Ramon Casiple. political analyst and advocate for political reform. And we hope that he can share some thoughts with us now from his reform, Institute of, from IPER, and advocacy against political dynasties.
Good morning. That was an interesting proposition by Professor, and it's really a question now how this applies to the Philippines in the post-pandemic situation that the Philippines has already gone into. And there's already a crisis in the Philippines. Just today, the president himself has admitted that there's still a lot that has not been done. There's a question really here of how do you think, I would like to ask the good professor, how do you think the Philippines particularly is handling the situation? Is it a situation where it becomes a political crisis, or it's still within the context of a health situation?
I'm sure, Mr. Casipe, that we can answer these. Dr. Magno will take that question and ask it to our panelists later on po in the open forum. After you share some, whatever you want to share po about your advocacy, sir.
Well, that's one topic I would like to have answered, but I'll wait for the discussion.
Okay, sir. In that case, baka if you will ask Dr. Magno to take note of that, so that later on in the open forum, in the discussion, you can participate, maybe share your thoughts, share some more questions as well later on, if that's all right with you.
Okay.
Okay. In that case, we'll move on now to Judge Dali Espanyol. Judge Espanyol is the founder and current chairperson of the Transparency International Philippines. She will discuss the importance of strong institutions, or at least we hope she discusses the importance of strong institutions in upholding transparency and accountability, especially during this pandemic. Judge Dali? Oh, I think you're on mute, po. You're on mute.
Okay. Yes,
yeah,
thank you very much, Paco, and everybody in Strat-based ADR institute, and the other partners that we have. I am going to talk about missed target and why. And good morning to everybody, and I'd like to start with my paper in this way. It was with great tribulation when President Rodrigo Roa Duterte was elected with overwhelming votes against his opponents. Obviously, due to his promised reforms in governance and his priority action against illegal drugs and corruption. Following the first State of the Nation, he has also several other commitments to enhance the life situation of the Filipino people, such as self-sufficiency of rice production, creation of more job opportunities, and the contractualization of workers, among others. After 4 years in office, the much-awaited program of reforms have been marred with the following incidents and issues that COVID-19 pandemic disease has magnified even more due to the following. First, there is disjointed policies aggravated by variance of implementation methodologies. war on drugs. The war on drugs used the extrajudicial killings, thinking that it will result in eliminating the illegal drug problem if the alleged drug users and pushers are apprehended and removed from the practice of using, selling, distributing the prohibited drugs. However, despite the number of unlawful deaths when police enforcers use force on alleged nanlaban suspects, the problem is still in a pandemic crisis. If we believe that there are about 27,000 deaths arising from the operation known as EKJ. Second, while the EKJ was going on, there were several smuggled or imported through the falsification of import documents of these illegal drugs. That, to my mind, this is a failed practice. This enormous importation of illegal drugs resulted in the investigation conducted by the Senate Blue Ribbon Committees on several occasions. Then we have the convicted drug lords. They continued their practice in the National Penitentiary, such that even the election of Senator De Lima was marred with the accusation that she was funded with drug money. Then, due to the proliferation of drugs, the Bureau of Customs has been the head of the Bureau of Customs has been replaced several times, and the replaced head of the Bureau of Customs found their appointments in some other corruption-infected bureaus. Then the fight against corruption, it is a failed fight also, because until now, even the distribution of cash allocation to the DSWD 18 million families have been marred with the corruption that resulted in the investigation of several LGU officials. Then in the Bureau of Customs, the tarifa system or the grease money system has also marred the implementation of corruption. Then there is this exodus of the high-profile prisoners in the National Penitentiary based allegedly on good conduct, which has resulted also in investigation of the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee. Then we have also the immigration commissioners who were also dismissed from the service because they were found to have extorted money from 500 or more workers in Clark Air Base. Then we have also the ghost payments to deceased patients allegedly who were still receiving the support for their hospitalization from the PhilHealth Insurance Corporation. Then we have the distribution of the purchase of the PPEs and other health materials to the different hospitals and quarantine facilities. Then we have this, lately we have the killing of the chief of the National Mental Center and his driver accordingly because he reported massive corruption in that center. Then we have another topic that I will discuss is the importation of commodities preferred over that of homegrown or locally produced items. While there are several government assistance programs to the farmers to achieve self-sufficiency of rice, there was also this importation of rice from ASEAN countries to send their scholars to the International Rice Research Institute in Los Baños, Laguna. So it is ironic that we are now importing rice from these countries. There was also this approval of the temporary importation of garlic and onions and even galunggong, which are fished here in our ocean territories. And they are still prevailing, or there is a glut in the market of these items because of this importation preferred over that of locally produced items. Then the importation of COVID-19 testing kits, it was preferred or it was given preference in the approval by the FDA over that of the UP assembled testing kits, which in the context of price difference, the imported ones are more expensive than the locally produced ones. Then we have the importation of fertilizers, which show that there are the difference in the price over that of the locally available fertilizer is really very high. Then the jeepney modernization program. The jeepney modernization program has resulted in the elimination of the traditional jeepneys in our roads, such that it displays so many drivers, and up to now, the problem is still prevailing. Some drivers have resorted to begging along the roads for assistance in kind or cash to support their families. And accordingly, there are about 6,000 more jeepney drivers who are waiting for them to be returned to their roads. Then the use of the DSWD 2015 data list of those who are supposed to receive financial assistance during this pandemic crisis. If we compute the number of families to be given this financial assistance together with the 5,000 families that were not included, then we are going to exceed the number of population that we have in the country. Then we have this the data adjustment system that has been going on. The tally of Philippine cases as of July 31 resulted in the increased number of infections from originally from below 80,000. Now it has gone up to 100,000 cases, and this is going to exceed, according to the recent report of the UP statistician, that it will even reach 1 million by the end of this year. Hopefully it will not. And then the next topic is the distorted notion of governance through extraordinary means, the use of threats and intimidation resulting in impunity, disinment, and disobedience. Prevalence of distorted judicial and or extrajudicial processes has been resorted to in order to expedite the attainment of personal agenda inimical to the public interest, and worse, it is in violation of the Constitution. Then we have the misapplication of judicial remedies like the quo warranto petition with the Chief Justice, and then the cancellation of the franchise of ABS-CBN. We also have threats and intimidation to abrogate the Manila and Manila Water Concession Agreement and incarcerate the proprietors thereof, although subsequently they were forgiven of their alleged offenses when the concessionaires generously responded to help and address the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Then the denial of the Congressional Committee on Public Franchises, merely based on the report, omitting facts, laws, rules, and regulations during the 12-day farcical hearings prepared in one day by the 3-man technical working committee members of the franchise application for renewal of ABS-CBN. Then the denial of application became very serious, as it also added 11,000 more workers who are going to be unemployed during this cancellation of the franchise of ABS-CBN. However, notwithstanding the cancellation, now the government is trying to engage the property and possibly the personnel of ABS and CBN for its modified learning system. But more seriously is the threat to sequester or to get the property of ABS-CBN from their own owners. Then we have in the last zona, there is this threat also of canceling the or taking over the 2 telcos in the country unless they shape up. But the problem that they were trying to solve is because the lack of cell sites or cell towers has come out because of the non-cooperation of the LGUs in extending the permits necessary, not only the LGUs, but also the national government has failed to extend the reforms that the telcos need in getting or permitting the construction of cell sites in the far-flung areas. But lately, yesterday, I think there was this report that there is a joint memorandum of agreement that is going to be issued, whereby the LGUs are mandated to issue the permits necessary to the telcos in less than a month. So why just now? But my time is up. But again, we have also this railroading of laws without academic and in-depth study of the socio-economic and security consequences, and very dangerous. It's very dangerous, and they normally resort to never-ending disgust, resentment, extrajudicial disturbances, mistrust, and if unchecked, to violent reaction. Such is happening in the anti-terrorism law, which has already resulted in the filing of 21 petitions before the Supreme Court requesting that it be declared unconstitutional, and there should be an issuance of the temporary restraining order and later a preliminary injunction to prevent its enforcement. During the Marawi siege, there was this promise that Marawi will be rehabilitated and restored to its original situation, but 3 years have passed and nothing has happened. To top it all, there is also this killing of the 4 armed forces of the Philippines intelligence officers by no less than the PNP officers and men in Sulu. Aside from that, there were also several bombing incidents that happened during the period under review. The amelioration program is endangering the evolving of a culture of mendicancy, and those who belong to the underprivileged group are just expecting to keep on providing, to keep on receiving food, money, shelter, and other necessities for as long as the pandemic disease abounds. My wish is, because of the national shortcomings that affect everyone, it is my wish, and I believe that we have to focus to the one and only protector, provider, healer, and savior. And as we are incapable of overcoming our material difficulties on our own, we have to resort to enriching our spiritual posture, because he will not abandon us nor forsake us. And I mean, we have to cling to the authority and power of the Almighty God. As a people of divergent personalities due to the various cultural influences of our colonizers, we have to face numerous issues affecting our identity as a people of a nation that is in the brink of being colonized again, due to our own complacency induced by our personal objectives and agenda, separate and distinct from what the Constitution requires of a public officer mandated to serve the public interest. We have 2 examples at the moment, and these are the Philippine territories being occupied by China despite the UNCLOS decision declaring these islands as part of the Philippine national territory. And 2, the diplomatic feud between the Secretary of Foreign Affairs and the Malaysian official, when Secretary Luksin asserted anew our claim on Sabah. As a people, we are recognized globally as intelligent, hardworking, learned, peace-loving, and resilient, to being able to overcome threats, trials, and tribulations. In fact, the U.S. Department has recognized the government payroll payment system that a Filipino scholar who was a soldier attended a scholarship program in the United States. This is just one among so many talents that Filipinos are known and recognized globally, but not in ours. I have faith that we need leaders who are compassionate to their compatriots and constituents, and not those who are exceedingly politicized in all aspects of governance. Leaders who do not practice attack and collect as a national policy, the production of blackies can be prevented, as they aspire to stay in public office as if they are personal property to be owned by enterprising politicians. At the risk of being branded as an activist, damn if I do and damn if I don't, let me cite some biblical passages to cap the topic of this paper, missed target. First, in Proverbs 1:7-29-33 verses. 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would not accept my counsel, not my counsel, the Lord's counsel. They spurned all my reproof, so they shall eat of the fruit of their own way and be satiated with their own devices. For the waywardness of the naive shall kill them, and the complacency of fools shall destroy them. But he who listens to me shall live securely and shall be at ease from the threat of evil. And last but not the least is in Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. For the Filipino people, we also have our biblical obligation to obey our leaders. In Hebrews 13:17, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. Pray for us, for we are sure that we have a good conscience, desiring to conduct ourselves honorably in all things. With this, I thank you very much, and God bless us all.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, po, Judge Dali. With that, po, I'll turn it over to Dr. Magno for our open forum. We will be moderating our open forum. I think, Dr. Magno, we have a few minutes before everybody starts getting hungry for lunch. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paco. So let's go directly to questions given by the audience for Professor Ayame. Comparing to Malaysia's move, what do you think the Philippines should have prioritized during the imposition of enhanced community quarantine from March 15?
All right. Thank you very much for the question. From my observation, I feel two fields are a little bit weak in the Philippines are a little bit weak in two fields. One is public health response. I do not know whether the Department of Health has been successful in doing contact tracing. For instance, if you read the report from the Ministry of Health of Malaysia, you know that they understand where the case comes from and then where it goes. There is a very detailed profile of each cases, and even the connection of the respective cases are shown there. I do not know whether the Philippines Health Administration has been able to do it. Another thing is that during the MCO period, Malaysian Health Ministry increased the capacity in terms of testing and also hospital more than 4 times and more than 2 times respectively. And also the second aspect is the financial provision. I think penalty alone is not sufficient to make people comply with the strict rules. There has to be a consent and there has to be an incentive. Malaysia's case, the government at least provided economic reliefs to the people, most of the people, such as I said, free internet, then cash aid and so forth. Then the implementation of this budget is very frequently reported. So you can have, the people could have a predictability as to when they can have the cash aid. Of course, once I start field work in Malaysia, there has to be so many different stories from this interpretation. But I think this is one of the things that prompted the people to comply with the strict lockdown. which contributed to the successful health response. So basically, the rigorous contact tracing and then upgrading the testing and hospital capacity on one hand, and also financial provision that gives an incentive for the people to stay at home. These are the two areas that Philippines government could have done a little bit more.
I also noticed in your presentation that the Ministry of Health is on top of the situation. Are there comparative insights with respect to the Philippines, with respect to the performance and the proactiveness of the health agency?
Well, my understanding about the Philippines is pretty limited, but for instance, statistics alone shows the weakness of the Department of Health in the Philippines, I guess. I've been updating the statistics of COVID from time to time, but the figures are really different. And it looks like they have not been able to grasp the comprehensive situation. So I think the capacity-wise, the Ministry of Health in Malaysia has stronger capacity.
Okay, thank you, Ayame. Let's go to Professor Arrow. There is a question here. What would you recommend on the part of citizen action to combat the infodemic?
Of course, media literacy and media education would be the key to combating fake news and the infodemic. And we need to ensure that the public would appreciate the role of media in a society. We should be free to criticize the media for everything that it does and everything that it does not do. And we can only know the correct way of appreciating media content through media literacy. We're not reinventing the wheel. We just need to further strengthen the drive of news media organizations and the academe in terms of media education. And of course, this is also the time for many journalists and news media organizations to really shape up and to be more careful in terms of reportage of events, to deeply contextualize the issues because the chilling effect is real. I don't want to mention specific news media organizations, but we're seeing the effect of the closure of ABS-CBN with the diminishing critical reportage, the failure to ask the hard questions. So these factors would tend to be contributory to the lack of critical analysis right now. So people should be not afraid to call out the media if ever there are weaknesses, particularly in critical reportage. Salamat po.
So just to follow up, you mentioned the proliferation of fake news, and in this age of the new social media, what is the citizen response with respect to the proliferation of fake news? As we all know, it's a global trend, the utilization of electronic trolls, use of data analytics to promote divisive politics, and that has been politically rewarding for some politicians. That's globally. So what's your take on this matter?
In terms of empirical data, you are correct. People are aware of fake news, and if we look at the more recent survey of Pulse Asia, it was proven that people have experienced or have been exposed to fake news at any point in their lives. So right now, the basic challenge for people would be really not to fall for fake news, because right now it's so easy. It's not because people are idiots or people are gullible when it comes to fake news. It's just that, as you correctly noted, it has become an industry. So there is more technological sophistication in creating, for example, memes, quote cards. You can even do deep fakes. You can fake videos of people saying things that are the exact opposite of what they believe in. So again, we go back to the need for media literacy and for people to be sure that what they share online would be just the truth. So the challenge lies not just on news media organizations, but also on the academe to make sure that they can be better champions of truth telling. Because the problem sometimes with academics like us is that we are so comfortable with our own respective echo chambers. So it's time to go out. It's time to engage publicly, just like what we're doing right now. So we have to expand such initiatives.
Okay, thank you, Professor Danny Araw. Let us now turn to Mon Casiple. Perhaps you can address that issue yourself, whether the current COVID-19 health crisis can become some kind of a political crisis.
It is a political crisis. If you follow the people who are speaking about it, it eventually comes to an end, which is political. What I mean here is that the ones who are criticizing the handling of government would end with the acts of government. And considering that the situation in the Philippines is that we are going into a electoral situation within 2 years, then you can say that the situation has become political. And I think you cannot do anything with it. It is already a political issue. Simply giving a position, either criticizing the government or supporting the government, in the current Philippine situation is already a political issue.
Okay, just a follow-up on, because a very good example would be the United States, where elections are forthcoming, and the performance of the current administration is certainly being affected given the surveys that are running now. So that health crisis is certainly a political crisis. Yeah. So Mon, in your analysis, how about the Philippines? But elections in this case would be 2 years from now. So very different from the United States, perhaps.
Well, that's true. We are still far from election. But even now, it is already an electoral issue. When the government is playing defensive in its handling of the crisis, the health crisis, it becomes political, and you cannot, just take it as if there's nothing important in that. I think what will happen is that the situation, the pandemic, would become a politically linked issue in the coming election in the Philippines.
Thank you, Mon. Let's now turn to Judge Española. You listed a good number of cases regarding rule of law. So from a civil society standpoint, citizenship standpoint, where should the advocacy be focused on? Is it to look at how the ombudsman is addressing these issues on corruption, or what types of institutional strengthening would you advise in terms of promoting the rule of law? Since you have mentioned a pretty good number of cases where you mentioned that the rule of law has been transgressed upon. Judge?
Yes. PI Philippines has been pushing for reforms in behavioral sector, meaning to say it should target the character of the public officers and even the constituents, because corruption is a behavioral problem. And to address a behavioral problem with force and intimidation, we cannot achieve anything about it. But if we are going to enhance the teaching of values, moral values, integrity, and all the characteristics of a righteous person, then I think we can move on. Although moving on through this matter is quite slow, but it is encouraging to cite that we have already approved the institution of the good moral character law. And I hope that it should be strengthened all the more to include not only the high school students, but even the professionals and those who are already in the workforce. Everybody should be included. They should have to categorize and prepare modules for their educational return, so that they will be able to imbibe the characteristics of what a righteous person should be. Because obviously, and I can see very many examples that those in government, most of those who are in government have different objectives or different agenda than when they were still in the high school or in college, because of the opportunity that is before them. So as time is changing so fast, we have to return to the basic requirement, and that is enriching the culture of righteousness among our people.
Thank you, Judge. Maybe let's go to the final question. I think this is a follow-up to the previous question regarding the oligarchy, because we started with that. Challenge to rules-based governance is political patronage, the presence of an oligarchy that affects the democratic system. So I think Dr. Ron Mendoza is still here, and perhaps our other speakers can also address this as a final question. This is a question from Dr. Raul Fabella. Is there a common understanding of oligarchs and the oligarchy? Seems to me that oligarch is used differently by different speakers. So I see that Dr. Ron Mendoza is still here. Maybe you can address that issue.
Thank you, Dr. Magno. I was planning to just listen towards the end, but since you called on me, I agree there are different interpretations of oligarchy and oligarchs. I rather defer to the definition that is broad, which is that this is a small group of powerful individuals or groups that can shape society as it is in politics or in economics. And so therefore it can fit basically the description of political dynasties, since they are they're very much concentrating power in the political system. Or it could also be in business when they are concentrating economic power. And I also very much agree with Dean July Tihanki and others, and I've also come to advocate this as a reform, that the best way to deal with oligarchy is to examine it as a behavior. And therefore, probably one of the ways to address it is to increase competition in order to temper the behavior of using your size to dominate your sector. So size in competition in competition policy is not necessarily a bad thing if you use size to promote innovation, if you use size to promote export market growth and generate jobs. Size does have its advantages, and we need some of those advantages from a development point of view. The challenge is if you use size to temper competition and to engage in rent seeking in order to preserve your size or even to accumulate more size. And so that's how I would understand oligarchy.
Thank you, Ron. Are there anybody from our panelists who would like to respond to the same issue? Or maybe we can just do a wrap up, and maybe in 3 sentences, how would you make public institutions matter? Maybe Judge, you start, Judge. Maybe just 3 sentences because we're running out of time.
Okay. I would like to say that oligarchy has done many things good also. But it depends on the one who is going to use it as a means of political agenda or political aspiration. So because I attended a conference in Singapore where oligarchy being controlled by just a few members of the families in Hong Kong has brought about the wealth and the supremacy in business of Hong Kong people. So I think oligarchy, if not taken in the context of politics, it is a good thing because we have also these families who are contributing enormously to the society where they are located.
Thank you, Judge. Mon Casiple?
Well, oligarchy is a political category actually. Even if it has economic advantages or aspects, I would rather look at it as something, a question of power. That's why whenever we speak about it, usually it's in relation to the state or state power. And I would like to confine myself to commenting on that aspect, since there are so many aspects which basically impact oligarchy itself, or coming from oligarchy impacts on politics. Just like what happened, for example, with the Lopez issue in the Philippines, and consequent effect on press freedom. This is a political issue, essentially.
Okay, thank you, Mon. Professor Danny Arau?
Hello. Well, there are only 3 points that I would like to stress given the lack of time. Number 1 is reaffirming media literacy. Number 2, opposing culture of impunity and the reign of tyranny. And number 3, defending press freedom. I think that would make for an effective media at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Danny Arau. Professor Ayame Suzuki, some final words.
As time is pretty much constrained, I just want to highlight that institution is really necessary in constraining the abuse of power of the leaders, and at the same time, it is very important in complement the lack of will on the part of the leadership or the weakness of the leadership. In here, institution, for instance, bureaucracy is one of the domains that the Filipinos may as well think about investing more. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ayame Suzuki. So back to you, Paco.
Thank you, Dr. Magno. Thank you, all the speakers. Actually, now that Dr. Magno has capped off our discussion, I would just like to close the event by thanking everybody on behalf of Professor Manhit, our convener, Dr. Magno, Strat-based ADRi, Democracy Watch, and our partner, Transparency International, for participating in today's discussion, both our speakers and our participants. Our current situation has really exposed how we need stronger public institutions, responsive legislation, and good governance. And this is best seen in how the health crisis has been politicized to attack media and telecommunications, as has been discussed today. And that's why we at Strat-based ADRi and Democracy Watch advocate for a whole society approach, wherein transparent and responsive public institutions work with and not attack the private sector, academia, and civil society to come up with solutions as a society. That said, I thank everybody for participating today and for contributing ideas and forwarding this shared advocacy of ours. Thank you, and apologies for talking too fast. We are running out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.